The jungle at night was a place of whispers and death. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, silvering the edges of leaves slick with rain. For Japanese infantrymen trained to believe darkness was their ally, the stillness promised advantage. Yet hidden in the American foxholes waited a weapon they had never truly faced, the Winchester M1897 Trench Gun, a pump-action shotgun that would turn the quiet of the night into a storm of thunder. By late 1943, Japanese high command still clung to the belief that spiritual strength and razor-edged bayonets could overwhelm American firepower. Their doctrine had been carved into every recruit since day one: the night belongs to us. Infiltration and sudden, close-quarters combat had humbled British and American forces before. Soldiers carried their rifles tipped with steel blades, expecting terrified opponents to break when the charge came. The jungle, dense and confining, was thought to negate industrial advantage. But that confidence met its match in the M1897. Originally designed in the 1890s for hunting waterfowl, the shotgun seemed an unlikely instrument of war. Yet its transformation during the Great War had already given it a reputation that bordered on infamous. German complaints to the Hague Convention labeled the weapon barbaric, a violation of civilized combat. The U.S. Army dismissed those protests. In muddy trenches, the ability to unleash 9 lead pellets with each shell made the M1897 fearsome in ways bolt-action rifles could not equal. It carried forward into the Pacific theater with a new role, fortified by a heat shield, equipped with a bayonet lug, and perfected for the brutal intimacy of jungle combat. On Bougainville and New Georgia, Japanese night raiders slipped through undergrowth as they had countless times before. Scouts whispered signals, blades glinted in faint starlight, and the expectation of panic in American lines carried them forward. But this time the first sound they heard was not the crack of a rifle. It was the metallic pump of a trench gun, followed by a roar that split the humid night. Entire squads fell before they reached striking distance. The weapon delivered not one bullet, but a storm of lead, spreading wider than any bayonet thrust could parry. Veterans later spoke of walls of thunder, a description that captured both the sound and the devastation it left behind. For Japanese commanders, the first encounters with the trench gun were dismissed as anomalies. Reports from Guadalcanal described Marines wielding a multi-projectile weapon that struck like lightning at close quarters. Officers labeled it dishonorable, a coward's tool used by soldiers unwilling to meet their enemy face to face. The recommended countermeasure was not innovation, but simply greater speed and fiercer resolve. To them, the answer to steel pellets was still the thrust of the bayonet, but the battlefield told a different truth. At Edson's Ridge in September 1942, Marine raiders positioned along defensive lines held pump-action shotguns that spat sheets of lead into the darkness. Japanese soldiers surged forward in waves, their cries piercing the night. Yet each charge dissolved before reaching the trenches. Survivors recalled the horrifying spectacle, men collapsing not singly, but in groups, as if an invisible scythe had swept across the jungle. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "We fought not against men, but against thunder. The air itself seemed filled with death." The M1897's effectiveness stemmed from a simple equation. A standard 12-gauge shell, packed with 9 pellets of 0 buckshot, turned every pull of the trigger into 9 simultaneous shots. In close jungle ranges of 15 to 20 yards, it was impossible to miss. A Marine could fire 6 shells in under 2 seconds by holding the trigger and cycling the pump, slam firing. In that heartbeat, more than 50 projectiles tore through the foliage, shredding anything in their path. Against bayonets and swords, it was no contest. Japanese infantry had trained their entire careers for close combat. At the Imperial Army Academy, cadets spent weeks drilling with rifles tipped by blades, rehearsing thrusts and parries until muscle memory made them second nature. Yet when those carefully practiced skills met the raw mechanical efficiency of the trench gun, they became obsolete in an instant. Survivors described wounds so catastrophic that field surgeons mistook them for artillery hits. Whole squads were reduced to silence within seconds. What unsettled the Japanese most was not only the physical destruction, but the psychological disintegration. Soldiers who once believed the night was theirs began to fear the unseen thunder waiting in the dark. The jungle that had promised concealment now echoed with the sudden violence of a farm boy's shotgun, transformed into a weapon of war. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more hidden World War II history. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? I'd love to know. By mid-1943, the shotgun was no longer a rare surprise but an established nightmare for Japanese forces. On New Georgia, a company of veterans launched a carefully rehearsed night infiltration against Marine positions near Munda Airfield. They moved with precision, bayonets blackened, confident their 3 years of experience gave them the edge. Yet when dawn broke, nearly the entire unit lay scattered across the jungle floor. Out of 187 men, only a handful survived. Marine reports later noted that defenders had fired over 2,000 shotgun shells in less than 20 minutes, creating a killing zone from which few emerged alive. Medical officers on the Japanese side coined a new phrase, shotgun syndrome. Unlike the neat punctures left by rifle bullets, the buckshot created multiple wound channels, ripping through flesh and bone with devastating effect. Field hospitals were overwhelmed by injuries so severe they resembled the aftermath of artillery bombardment. Surgeons trained for bayonet thrusts and single projectile wounds now faced bodies torn apart in ways that defied traditional methods of care. It was not simply the loss of manpower, but the crushing realization that their doctrine could not protect them. Even senior officers began to question long-held beliefs. Colonel Teo Ido reviewed casualty data and recorded in his journal a sobering conclusion. Our night attacks have become suicide. The Americans have made the darkness their ally. His words reflected a shift that crept through the ranks, an acknowledgement that the warrior spirit was no match for concentrated firepower at close range. At Bougainville, the full extent of the weapon's dominance became impossible to ignore. Major Chaguero's battalion, more than 800 men drilled specifically in infiltration tactics, attempted to overrun Marine lines during a night assault. Interlocking fields of shotgun fire cut them down in minutes. Survivors recalled the jungle itself erupting with lead, describing how entire groups collapsed at once. One officer, Lieutenant Mishima, survived by lying motionless among the dead, later confessing, "There was no glory, no combat, only execution." These experiences forced Japanese intelligence officers to produce secret reports acknowledging that close combat was no longer viable against American units armed with shotguns. Their conclusion was blunt. Spiritual strength had been eclipsed by mechanical pragmatism. The Winchester M1897 did more than alter tactics. It struck at the very mythology of the Japanese army. For years, commanders preached that courage and spiritual purity could overcome industrial power. Bayonet manuals emphasized that a single warrior's resolve outweighed the mechanical advantages of 10 opponents. But when squads vanished in seconds under a curtain of buckshot, even the most loyal soldiers began to doubt. The weapon was not just killing men, it was dismantling faith. Captured diaries revealed the psychological collapse in raw terms. One entry found on New Georgia read, "We charged with honor, yet they answered with thunder. My comrades disappeared before reaching the line. This is not war, this is slaughter." Another officer admitted privately, "We bring swords to a storm. They fight without bushido, but they fight to win." Such confessions were heresy to Japanese doctrine, but they reflected the undeniable truth. Spiritual determination could not shield flesh from steel pellets. On the American side, the shotgun's reputation grew legendary. Marines referred to it as the trench broom, a tool that swept clean any assault. Gunnery Sergeant Robert Holmes, who trained men in its use, explained, "At 10 yards, that Arisaka rifle might as well be a club. But my shotgun throws a baseball-sized pattern of death every half-second." It was a cold equation. 6 shells in 2 seconds meant 54 projectiles saturating a space the size of a foxhole. Against that, bayonets were useless. Production figures underscored American pragmatism. By 1945, over 1.2 million military shotguns had been manufactured, with tens of millions of shells shipped to Pacific units. Every Marine division carried them into battle. Where Japanese forces invested years of training into perfecting a thrust, American factories produced crates of weapons that could annihilate that skill in moments. By late 1943, Japanese commanders could no longer ignore the results. Reports from Cape Torokina admitted that 90% of casualties in certain engagements came from shotgun fire. Average engagement time before annihilation, 4 minutes. The data painted a grim picture. Close combat, once the pride of the Imperial Army, had become suicide. The shotgun had stolen the night from the Japanese soldier, turning their most prized tactic into a death sentence. By the time the war ground into its final phases, the Winchester M1897 had transformed from a tool of hunting into a symbol of American pragmatism. On Peleliu and Okinawa, Marines expected the familiar cries of bands at charges. Instead, they faced something new, Japanese defenders who no longer rushed blindly into fire, but clung to caves and pillboxes, forcing Americans to dig them out with flamethrowers and explosives. The shotgun, which had shattered night assaults, had also reshaped enemy doctrine. Close combat was abandoned, replaced by defense in depth. Ironically, by surviving against the trench gun, the Japanese made battles even bloodier for both sides. Yet the psychological wound lingered long after the battles ended. Veterans on both sides carried memories they could not bury. Marines wrote letters home describing the horror of what buckshot did to the human body, many confessing nightmares that lasted decades. Japanese survivors spoke in hushed tones of thunder guns that stripped away honor, leaving only terror. At veterans' reunions years later, former enemies wept together, acknowledging that the weapon had stolen not just lives, but illusions. It had broken the myth that spirit alone could triumph over steel. Historians see in the Winchester M1897 a lesson that goes beyond calibers and tactics. It demonstrated the fatal cost of rigid thinking. Japan invested in the spirit of the bayonet. America invested in industrial efficiency. One believed courage could negate technology. The other armed even farm boys with machines designed to multiply force. The shotgun was not glamorous, nor was it romantic. It was brutally effective. In that simplicity lay its power. When the Japanese Self-Defense Force was formed after the war, its planners quietly acknowledged the irony. Shotguns were now part of their standard close combat arsenal, a weapon once condemned as dishonorable now deemed essential. The shift symbolized more than military adaptation. It marked the collapse of a philosophy. Bushido had not been defeated by greater honor or nobler ideals. It had been silenced by the mechanical slam of a pump-action shotgun in the night. The story of the M1897 is not merely about a weapon. It is about the collision of myth and reality, and the cost when leaders refuse to adapt. In the jungles of the Pacific, thunder spoke louder than tradition, and it changed the course of a war.